Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with David Damrosch in conversation with Martin Puchner. My name is Jamie Madsen. I'm the marketing and events coordinator here at Copperfields, and I'll also be your host for the evening. So just a couple of things to note before we get started. Go ahead and pop open your chat box tonight. I will be using it to provide links for tonight's title, discount codes, a link to Martin's upcoming title, and all the goodies. So that will be in the chat box. Additionally, the format will feature between 35 to 45 minutes of speaking and will be followed by a live Q&A. Go ahead and please submit your questions and comments under the Q&A icon, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. And now I'm really excited to introduce tonight's author, David Damrosch. David is the chair of comparative literature at Harvard University and the director of Harvard's Institute for World Literature. He is the author or editor of 25 books, including What is World Literature, The Buried Book, Comparing the Literatures, and 6-volume Longman Anthology of World Literature. He has lectured in 50 countries around the world and has, in his online Harvard course called Masterpieces of World Literature, has been taken by nearly 100,000 people. And in conversation with him tonight is fellow professor of English and comparative literature at Harvard University, Martin Puchner. Martin's prize-winning books and anthologies range from philosophy to the arts. His book, The Written World, a Wall Street Journal bestseller, has been translated into some 20 languages. He's a member of the European Academy and has received numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Coleman Fellowship, and the Berlin Prize. So they are with us tonight to discuss David's newest title, Around the World in 80 Books. I'm really excited to hand it over to you, Martin. Why don't you get us started?
Hi, thank you so much, Jamie. It's great to be here. And I just want to start by giving this plug to this incredible book, Around the World in 80 days, in 80 books, in 80 days, in 80 books. You read it much faster because it's actually really fluently written. It's an incredible journey of discovery. I thought I had read a lot, and as always, when interacting with David, you realize no, in fact, I have only touched the surface. So it's really incredible discovery. But you'll learn a lot, but not because someone is stuffing knowledge down your throat. It's a very light-footed, very fast-moving book because we have to get around the world in 80 days. So, and in 80 books. So it's moving fast and it's great fun. So David, it's such a great book and it's such a you book. And I want to talk about that a little later. But let's maybe start sort of with the origin of this book, because I know you'd had sort of the idea in the back of your mind for a while, but then the lockdown happened and then a blog happened and then this book went viral, or the blog posts. How did that happen?
Well, it was an interesting process because I've been thinking about it for several years. Having written a lot on world literature for students and faculty, I thought, well, must be some way to bring this excitement of all this reading to a general public. And I had thought maybe 7 years ago, oh, Around the World in 80 Books, that's a nice conceit. But I was sort of stewing over it and thinking, oh, how do I keep it from just being one damn book after another? Just feeling like, what's it really going to be the emotional core, really, as well as the narrative arc? So I was fiddling with it, thinking about it. And then I had planned this to January 2020. I sort of worked out, okay, I'll go, get a number of things happening in different places. I'd go to these places. As you did a number of cases for your fantastic book, The Written World. Further plug for this amazing, great book, which you can get in paperback.
We're talking about a different book, David. You're talking
no. That's right. Well, the two intertwine. Just like Jamie mentioned, our joint course on Masterpieces of World Literature, which is online to the Harvard X platform. But so I was thinking, all right, I'll go to some different places. I'll talk about literature associated with those places. And then the COVID hit. And I got in one last trip to Muscat, where is my author, Joker Al-Harti in Oman. But then all these things got canceled in Serbia and in the Netherlands and in Chicago and in Tokyo. And I realized I just couldn't go. So I thought, oh, well, so much for that. But then I thought, well, I have the books. And then one of my themes is that books are made out of both personal issues and other books. And so, of course, there's Jules Verne, but then also I thought of this fantastic book by this young French nobleman from the 18th century, Javier de Maistre, who got into a duel, which you're not supposed to do. And the judge sentenced him he quarantined him 42 days in his room. And a quarantine originally was 40 days in port. So it's really a quarantine. And he treated his room as a kind of grand tour. He wrote this delightful book, Voyage autour de ma chambre, about going around his room. I thought, all right, put together Jules Verne and Javier de Maistre, and we have a plan. So then I thought, okay. And in the summer of 20, a year ago, being very much stuck in Brooklyn and then in Maine, and Brooklyn was a real epicenter of the virus then. We were often having two different sirens at the same time, almost all the time outside the window. I felt a real need to get out into the world of our imagination, the world of books. So it gave a kind of a impetus to the project. And I thought, all right, let me just do it as a blog. I can't go anywhere really except the internet. I can go on that. So I started doing that, and I did do it in 80 days, in fact, mimicking Phileas Fogg, Jules Verne's hero in the story. So it was 16 weeks, 5 books a week, giving myself a weekend to take off the weekend in this point where time had completely collapsed, right? But 5 days a week. And it had various effects. It made it much more conversational than I think I would otherwise have done. And that in the book itself that way, and more personal. It became more of a memoir of a life of reading than I had intended, more about my family, my own history. And it's partly like, how do books bleed into your life? How does the world bleed into books? So it was a kind of a chance to talk about that.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I remember, seeing from many of my Facebook friends who were following you, people who were not necessarily in the kind of world literature world, and that was such a response. It's clear that people were craving that and loved being taken on this journey by you.
And I think part of the blog format that was so salutary for me, it's so unlike how we usually think as academics, where you might, spend months working on a chapter, 50 pages in manuscript to discuss your reading of one book. But here I had, 1,500 words every day, head to head do it. I couldn't have more because I didn't have time to do more than that. And it was really interesting because it's not just writing 1,500 words a day is not so hard, but every single day it's a different book. So having to completely change gears, which is not what we're used to doing at all. But it also meant on the positive side that every week those 5 books were in my mind all at the same time. So they resonated in a very much of a strong way. And then from week to week. And certainly it was therapeutic in some way for the folks who followed it. And within a week or two, there were followers in 8 different countries who asked if I would mind if they would start translating postings into Chinese and Ukrainian and Arabic. And so that was quite something.
Yeah. But, I just want to make sure everyone heard you right. So this was it was a marathon. I mean, this is you really replicated that feat of traveling around the world in 80 days and the changing of gears and the different vehicles and the different challenges to overcome. And you did that as a kind of a marathon reader.
And in fact, on the 80th day, I posted my last posting at precisely 8:45 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which is the moment at which Phileas Fogg comes back into his club 5 minutes before he would lose his bet. So I felt I needed to do that. Yeah.
It's not just writing. It was kind of a performance, or it was almost like a bet, or something that you felt compelled to do. And that I feel like, you say it's not so hard to write 1,500 words per day, but I feel like you're really the person to do this. I don't know many people who could have even attempted it. And
well, the thing that was so much fun about it, really, and I think that then with the book, I had the chance to polish it better because things were dashed off. So the book is actually much, it's the perfected version because if you have only 1,500 words and you have really a day, you have to think, all right, what is the essence of what I want to communicate? What really matters? I mean, there's a Monty Python routine called the Summarize Proust competition where the contestants have 30 seconds to summarize Proust and they all fail, right? But so I had, a day on Proust, right? So what am I going to do in 1,500 words to say, why does Proust matter so much to me? Why does Paris matter so much? What kind of world does he give us? How does he go from his own experience to that world? How does his sexuality come in? How does food come in? How does a bois de Boulogne come in? And I have 1,500 words. And it was really, very exciting to think, all right, get to the essence of it. Partly, we talk fairly often when we teach together world literature. It's very hard now to get students to read 300 pages a week. They have too much other things to do, too many social media commitments, whatever else.
Too many blog posts about literature.
Reading blog posts, exactly. Writing blog posts, right? Performing blog posts. And I think that increasingly less is more. That, of course, we hope that everyone will read the entire Tale of Genji or the entire Recherche du Temps Perdu. But they're not only going to do that if they get really turned on in some way. So my utopian hope with the book is that it's a freestanding book itself. It should be readable, as I think you kindly said. And at the same time, I hope that any given reader unpredictably will find from this, which 6 books on this list do they want to come into Copperfields, one of its 9 branches, and buy those 6 books, right?
And no, I mean, I know for me, this book will be, I'll be working off this book for, I know, many years to come, because it's such a, I got so excited about so many works that I had never heard of, and that I know I will want to read. And because you put these works in relation to each other, I feel like, okay, I already have some way in. I maybe heard of this book, I read this book. And so it doesn't seem like this completely foreign object anymore. It's already embedded in something. So, yeah.
And of course, half the book is, it should be famous classic works, some of which people will know. So you have Virginia Woolf. And I made a point actually of starting with the more familiar to more people. So I deliberately started in London and Paris with, Virginia Woolf, Dickens, Conan Doyle, Proust, some other, well-known writers, and then we can go further afield.
Yeah. And wisely, you also departed from the actual itinerary. I mean, you follow the itinerary to some extent, but you depart, as you yourself say, because there's no South and Latin America, for example, and so you just decide, you take the time, because you write so fast, you had time to do a little detour to Brazil and Mesoamerica. Was that something where you just felt like, I need to get that in there? It makes no sense to leave off that all of these cultures, or was that a hard decision, or was it?
Well, the hard decision was having only, in the end, 16 cities or regions. For a long time, we were going to be 20, which is already difficult, with 4 per one, but it began to seem too much all over the place. And then also, once I started to have the 5 days a week, it crystallized that. So there were, I would have loved to have had St. Petersburg. I would love to have had, I was for a long time going to have Iceland, because Icelandic is one of the things I work on, Iceland and the Faroe Islands, which is the only place I've eaten whale blubber. It's a really good place to go, and met a very cool contemporary Icelandic writer, Sjón, who writes for Björk, really cool guy. So there were all these choices. I mean, with Jules Verne, he's really following essentially trade routes of the British Empire. And so a post-imperial version of this will go to more places. The world is much more various. And it was important to me to have as many continents as possible. I don't have Antarctica, although we do have, it's published by Penguin, so in some sense we have an Antarctic foot, webbed foot there. But otherwise we're getting to and I didn't get to Australia, which I would have loved to have Sydney also, but I had to make these tough choices. And then partly it was places, almost always places I've been that matter a lot to me, that have been vivid to me. And then there's a great body of literature and things like I've worked on over the years, like Mesoamerica, or Brazil, or Kyoto. They're such great works. And just give a flavor of how a place gets created by writing, how the writers get created by the place. That kind of interchange is really interesting.
Yeah. And, let's talk about some of these places that really matter to you, and you yourself, you weave yourself and your relation to some of these works of literature and places so beautifully also into this book. Like one place, of course, I was very intrigued by that, casual readers of world literature may not associate with world literature is Mount Desert Island in Maine.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that as an example?
I made a point, having started out with London, and of course, Phileas Fogg, he ends up at the East Coast of the United States, where he then returns. He's gone across the US from San Francisco, and then he departs. But for me, it was sort of a homecoming a little bit. So I just thought it was interesting, and not to overdo the personal side, but once people got to know me a little bit, the last two chapters are where I was born, Mount Desert Island, and then New York, where I was an adolescent, and where I met my first professional writer, Madeleine L'Engle, who was a parishioner of my father's at the church. And I met Saul Bellow and Saul Steinberg, three of the people that I talk about in that chapter. And Bar Harbor is interesting to me.
Can you just describe, so maybe not everyone knows Mount Desert Island?
Yeah. Or as we say in Bahaba, Mount Desert Island.
Yes.
We pronounce it differently.
Because there's really neither a mountain, nor is there a desert, nor is it an island.
It is an island. It's connected by a bridge, as you know, to the mainland.
Is that a bridge, or is that kind of a...
Two little bridges.
An actual bridge. All right.
An actual bridge. A little bit like More's Utopia, right? Which was a peninsula that was cut off to be an island. So one of my other books. And I was going to have ended with Bar Harbor, where I was born, but then the chapter before turned out to be all about islands and the Antilles, Derek Walcott and Jean Rees and Margaret Atwood and Judith Shalansky, who I think is an amazing, interesting writer, Atlas of Remote Islands. So then I thought, if I have just said the islands in the Caribbean, then I should go to the Mount Desert Island and then to New York at the end, which is also the jumping off point to go home. But it's very much, and with Mount Desert Island, I get to talk about how we encounter the world first, the wider world, as children. And I had never been outside of Maine. I'd never been outside the US as a kid or as an adolescent either. But so it's through literature that I'm starting to read. So The Voyage of Dr. Dolittle, which is one of the ones I talk about there. It was my first idea about England, was books like that. And actually, Hugh Lofting wrote it in Connecticut. So he was by that point an American author also. So that's an interesting phenomenon.
And speaking of children's big books we encounter as children, the last book is Lord of the Rings.
Which I first encountered at age 10 or so, just after we moved to New York. And I read it like 8 or 9 times. It was the book of books for me. And I couldn't resist ending with it as the way to come back then to England, to have a British book at the end, because it sums up so many themes. Partly how, like so many writers, he's building a world in response to trauma. In his case, particularly World War I, where all but one of his best friends died in the trenches. He fortunately didn't die. He was wounded and invalided back. And he starts writing what he called the Book of Lost Tales at that point in 1917. Then he's dealing with just modernity, but he's also just dealing with this incredible fantasy world that he develops. And it's a book about books. It's a book about writing. It's a book about scripts, very much. And it was, to me, the book that opened up the world and how you can really create a world par excellence. And it's the best-selling novel in history, probably 150 million copies.
It is now, though, when you read it, it was actually much less widely known, right? How did you even, how did it end up in your hands, that book?
There was a first boom of interest in the US in Tolkien just at that time. It had been published in hardcover to not many sales in England in the 50s. But then in around about 64, 65, there was a pirated paperback edition in the US that started to sell well. And then there was a little scandal about it. And then there was an authorized edition. And I would go and buy them with my $1 weekly allowance. The paperback for each volume cost 95 cents plus 5 cents tax. So it was perfect for the dollar. So that was just the very beginning of that boom. And it just struck me. And indeed, one of my other authors is Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. And I'm absolutely convinced people never talk about those two books together. One of my themes is that world literature includes popular literature, detective fiction, as well as the great masterpieces. But I'm absolutely convinced that the then runaway success of Garcia Marquez in North America would not have happened without the popular success of Tolkien a couple of years before. It paved the way for magical realism, because you had actual magicians, right? Gandalf, you have magic, and you have fantasy realism, and that opened out the world for Garcia Marquez.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And, this just, since you mentioned how you got your hands on that mass market paperback and these editions, it reminds me that, it's not a major theme, but it pops up again and again. Libraries, bookstores. I think we were asked by Copperfield Books to remind everyone to buy your book, which everyone should do, either through Copperfield Books, but hopefully
Ideally.
at least not through Amazon. So do you want to talk a little bit about this theme of libraries, bookstores, teachers, how people get books, and how you, people that turned you into this incredible reader that you've become?
Well, indeed, one of the my ninth grade high school, my ninth grade English teacher, Miss Stats, turned out in the course of the book to be a kind of fairy tale donor figure, because she gives me the book that changed my life at the beginning, Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern. I'm in ninth grade, 15 years old, but she thinks I have this kind of weird sense of humor that I might appreciate it at a rather young age. It blows me away. I've never read anything like this. It's sexy, it's hilarious, it's meta-fictional, it's fiction about fiction, it's incredibly lively work. And I think, well, I want more like this. So where do I get that? And Stern's hero Tristram, it's his life and opinions, but he has so many opinions he can never get to his life. It takes him hundreds of pages even to get born. But thanks to that, he speaks at one point of my dear Rabelais and my dear Cervantes. I did not know who those people were, but I went to my local bookstore right next to my school bus stop in New York, and there was a whole bookcase of Penguin classics. And there was the Penguin Classic editions of Don Quixote and a Gargantuan Pantagruel. So I buy these. I love them. I thought these are really cool. So it's a really interesting thing. So it's a person hands me a book, and then it's also a bookstore that has then where you go on from there.
And it's great that it's Penguin, of course, and Penguin is the publisher of your book.
Yes. Things get coming, what goes around comes around. I then tell the story. After that, I thought, all right, I really like this rollicking, funny, satirical, sexy stuff. What else can I get? In the back of Penguin. So again, then the books recommend other books. So Penguin have a little list of other publications, much like Amazon's algorithms today. And I see this thing called the Divine Comedy. Think, I'll get that. I discovered it's not quite the knee slapper that I thought it was, but I was a preacher's kid, and this is serious. I like this stuff now. I'm getting more. I'm 16 years old now. I'm ready for this serious stuff. So finishing that, I think, well, what can I read more like this? In the back of the book, I see Nikolai Gogol, Dead Souls, which turns out to be the sparkling satire that I thought that Dante was.
I don't know whether that is a cautionary tale about mistitling books or titles, or in fact not, that it doesn't matter, and that if you evoke the wrong impression, people might get to this book anyway, and
that's right.
And adjust.
Yeah, and sometimes titles can have just think of Jules Verne. This is parody that the title hopes to get a reader. One of my favorite subtitles, Robert Benchley, the American humorist of the mid-20th century, had a collection of his essays called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, or David Copperfield. I thought that was great.
Yeah. And so when I said initially that I think this is a very you book, and I say this because, we've known each other for decades, we teach together, is that I think you, more than anyone I know, you think in books, and one book makes you think of another book, and you have this associative mind that where one thought sparks the next and sparks the third. And of course, all your wonderful books are your books. You have written them. No one else could have written it. But I feel like this is sort of the quintessence of David Damrosch, because it really takes people who don't know you on this wild ride of books made out of other books, books referring to other books, a world of books.
Well, partly one of my themes is that books are really made out of two different networks, one of which is the great conversation that they have with each other. And so many of these books are in dialogue, sometimes antagonistic, sometimes not, sometimes satiric. So that's one kind of network. And the other network is the synapses in our own brain. So whatever we're reading, even if these authors never heard of each other, it's going to resonate with what we find in them that relates to what matters to us, what's going on in our own lives. So the kind of triangulation between, as it might be, Garcia Marquez, Tolkien, and myself, or of whoever is reading. One of the things that's fascinating to me about this project was because of the pressure of both the COVID and generally this rise of a kind of ethno-nationalism, a closing down of walls, barriers. I had a need for books that are about travel, about breaking out of confined spaces, utopian spaces, differential spaces, like that. And it also meant that under the moment, so if it wasn't for the pandemic, I would have read a number of these books very differently. So it turns out that, pandemics and epidemics turn out to be either a literal thing that happens in surprising number of books, like Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, there's a whole series of plagues and pandemics, but also it becomes a metaphor. So both in Boccaccio, where there is an actual pandemic, but also in Tagore, The Home and the World, in both cases, both love and politics are described as epidemics that infect you, that you have to get over. So it's a connection that I'm sure Tagore was not thinking of Boccaccio when he makes that connection. He's just thinking of politics in Bengal at the time. But now reading them at that moment of pandemic, it highlights that theme.
Yeah. And you're of course such a great traveler. We heard that you've lectured in 50 countries, but that this book was born out of this moment where you had, as you described, where you had to stay home. And this just made me think that it's in some ways maybe an obvious thing, but something that we forget, or at least people like you or me, since I also travel a lot, forget, is that people always dismiss, oh, this is just an armchair traveler, someone who sits in an armchair and reads. But it is a reminder, and this book and knowing how it emerged is a reminder that maybe we shouldn't be so dismissive of the armchair, that this is something that books have always done, to taken us on these imaginary travels. And that
I really believe that literature is, I think we share this belief, it's a privileged form of encountering of the world. It's not a literal encounter. Writers are never simply reproducing. I'd like to say that they don't reflect the world, they refract it. They're creating worlds of their own that are in some kind of skewed, off-centered relationship. And often the creative writers have been thrown off-center in this society one way or another, and that's what makes them a great writer. Someone who's just perfectly content in the middle of their culture is probably not innovative, particularly. They're going with the flow. They're doing something very solid, but they're not going to do something transformative. So virtually every writer we can think of is in some way, either they are literally migrants, and many are, or they're just sort of set aside from on whatever basis. It may be class, it may be sexuality, it may be religion, it may just be irony. Something is just putting them aside. And I think for myself, I'm interested a good deal in ancient Near East. I fell in love early on with Egyptian art, Mesoamerican art. But if I only had the art and the architecture, I would only know hardly at all how their minds were working. You have these amazing, mysterious, totally enigmatic structures. But then if you find the poetry that's in the tombs in Egypt, the songs for excellent enjoyment, and you say, wow, these people, I can find out who their gods are, I think how they relate to them. It's just the most privileged form of encountering the world. And in particular, I think these days more than ever, I quote in my preface, a note by Chimamanda Adichie, who was one of my authors. She had this TED talk called The Danger of a Single Story, which has been seen 24 million times. And she talks about how growing up in Nigeria, she only was reading imported English children's books, the same ones that I was reading in Maine, reading these Anglophile imports. And when she discovers African authors, it makes her realize, oh, there's not just one story. And so much of the media today are trying to just feed us one story that the algorithm tells them we want to hear already. And I think literature is the best way to open out from that entrapment in our own algorithms.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah,
Meta's algorithms for us.
Yeah. You described how, you're taking essentially this imaginary journey by walking around your library, but it
Right.
it made me wonder exactly. But in before the pandemic, you were this incredible traveler, and that's something, of course, that comes through in every single page in this book, because you connected to these places, and often you've been to these places, you share some memory of these places, perhaps you're able to observe this refraction, of the place, and what an author have done with it. But so it made me wonder, where before the pandemic, where do you read, especially in connection to travel? Do you read before travel, during, after, all three? How does that the actual act of reading take place in the world for you?
Very varied, and a lot depends on happenstance and chance. But I often do try to learn some new author if I'm going someplace I haven't been. It was the case with Joka Alharti, and she had just won the Man Booker Prize, the first Arab woman and the first Omani ever to win that prize. But I think I wouldn't have gotten to it except, well, I happened to be going there. So then I picked it up.
Before going.
Just before going.
Just before going.
In Bangkok, I encountered 2 or 3 authors, partly on recommendations from my hosts there. And then I find, of those ones I read, which one really sticks with me. And then I've ended up writing about one of those and keep returning to them. So it is a voyage of discovery. Other times it's like, for years, I've been reading and teaching Tale of Genji before I ever made it to Japan. So this was like, all right, now I have to go see. And of course, you're seeing modern Japan, but you're also seeing these amazing temples that date back to the Heian period. And you get the sense of the layeredness of history. And one of the things that I, as a American, not a sophisticated European like yourself, but we have a very shallow American cultural history, unless you learn about the native traditions. Whereas going to some place like Mexico City or Kyoto or Cairo, you have thousands of years of history right there in these different layers, and that absolutely fascinates me.
Yeah, and that comes through in your wonderful book, The Buried Book. You actually do structure it as a dig, starting with the present and then going further down to the layers of this incredible book. So
yeah, in this book I did with space what I did with time with that one. With that Buried Book, I want to talk about Epic of Gilgamesh and its origins. I thought, well, a general reader doesn't know why they should care or doesn't know how to access. So I start with the present, with what's familiar, and they're going down. So too in this book, spatially, starting with London and Paris seems to me like the way in, and then you can start to go, even like with Krakow, where I go next. Poland was not such an obvious choice, but for me it was personal. I could easily have had instead Berlin. I work a lot on German literature. I managed to fit in a few German writers in the course of the book, but Krakow was for me.
So thank you for that.
You're so welcome. That's right. But Kafka, I put in Kafka there. There I'm talking about how literature works. How do we read after Auschwitz? How does literature get written after it? And for me, this was, it was where this is where I thought, all right, here's how I can make the personal side work. So my grandfather's grandfather, the first Damrosch I know about, came from there. Was then German territory. He came from what they called Posen, which is now Poznan, in Western Poland. And I'd never been, always heard about it, so I had to give a talk in Krakow. And my host took me to, I gave a talk in Poznan, talk in Krakow. And so I'm walking around in Poznan, and so I took here's a picture of downtown Poznan. I think, oh, suppose my great-great-grandfather had never left Leopold. Suppose I'd grown up there, eating sausages instead of Big Macs, maybe reading Conrad in Polish translation instead of in his original English. Of course, I knew it would have been a different family, but my father was named after the same great-great-grandfather, so it's easy to sort of imagine, right? But then my host take me to Krakow. On the way, we passed a sign for Auschwitz. And I realized the Damrosch has never left. that's where he would have been.
Yeah.
And then for that, I give a picture that my mother-in-law took in Auschwitz in 1948, just after the war, visiting it. So that sort of personal side. I remember one of the blog readers said, so dark so soon. But a lot of my point is that literature takes the most traumatic events and makes works of beauty and power out of them. And that's important, helps us process what happens in our lives.
And it bears witness to those events.
As we say, one of the authors I talk about there is Czesław Miłosz, Nobel Prize winner, very, very interesting poet who I read a little of and then had read more for this. He says at age 92, he has a poem called Heavenly, and he says he hopes, rather like Socrates in heaven, he says, I'll be able to keep doing what I started on earth, that is to strive unceasingly, to be striving itself, and never have my fill of touching the shimmering weave on the loom of the world.
Mm.
And he survived the war and all these things and communism and exile. And yet as a poet, he makes this incredible rich life and then returns late in life and resettles in Krakow.
Since you mentioned your family, it's been amazing to me how different members of your family pop up in the book now. For some people who may know your family's names, association with music, bringing Mahler to the United States, Damrosch Park as part of Lincoln Center. But I was really struck by this portrait of Tagore, sketched by a relative of yours also, namely Helen Damrosch.
My great aunt Helen, who's my favorite relative when I was growing up. I knew her, she was about 80 years old and I was a teenager. She was born in 1892. And she remembered this little musical world that she'd grown up with. Her father, my great-grandfather, had founded what became Juilliard, and she knew all that world. And she was an artist and a very live wire and a great traveler. She used to, she was a scientific illustrator, among other things, married to a specialist in Caribbean fishes, who later became the head of the Bronx Zoo. And she would actually paint in the Caribbean underwater, 10 feet down, wearing a diving helmet, because the fish would lose their colors if she brought them out. So she'd paint on a kind of slate, and she had to. She told me she had to tie the brush to the stand so that it wouldn't float away. And she was just her last idea for a book. She wrote several books that she illustrated. Her last idea came at age 75 when Batman appeared at her window. She's living on the 10th floor and told her to write a book about bats.
That's so wild.
And so Tagore, she happened to be.
Yeah. So how did she come to sketch this portrait of Tagore?
So this makes me very happy. And it's part about weaving this thing. And I just quoted Milosh, weaving on the loom of the world. And a number of my figures are like Penelope figures who compare themselves to Penelope or to Scheherazade or both. And the weaving together of the elements, partly it's chance. So I was not going to have Tagore in the book. I had lots of other people. But one of my followers in Delhi says, you're coming to India, you don't have Tagore. So we have Tagore. So, but once I decided to put in Tagore, so the follower recommended another one of Tagore's books that's very long and out of print. And I thought, well, I don't have time to read that 500-page, 700-page book, and it's out of print. And I wanted things that people could actually read. So I thought, all right, The Home in the World, his best known book. And then I realized, all right, he published it in 1916, 3 years after he won the Nobel Prize for Gitanjali in 1913. Then he becomes a global celebrity. He makes his first world tour, in which he comes to New York, and my Aunt Helen sketched him. So that's why it's in there. It wasn't planned until I realized, oh, wait, here it is.
It's so great. And I mean, I think it's perfect that Tagore is in there, not because of that connection, but also because, as you mentioned, he became such a world traveler. I mean, of course, the first non-Western author to get the Nobel Prize. I mean, an incredibly important figure. But would it be an exaggeration to say that he was the first global author in the sense of traveling more widely, and more importantly, that global travel played a bigger role in his life as an author than almost any other author before?
Well, that's very interesting. I pair him with Rudyard Kipling, comes just before,
yes,
who I believe it would be the two of them, I think, are early examples of this together. to me, Kipling is possibly the first, I would say, as a global author, in the sense of someone who, when he starts out as a very local Anglo-Indian writer, very precocious, writing about age 20. By the time he's 25, he's being published all over the world. And most of his audience is abroad. And he's writing, he's being published in the United States and in Scotland and Australia. And then he starts to become this huge world traveler, settling in various places, including in Vermont for a couple of years, South Africa, spends a lot of time, Rhodesia, back and forth with England after India. So, and the idea from the very start of his career, he knows he's writing for a world audience, mostly to whom he has to explain his little piece of the world. And then Tagore is responding to that, winning the Nobel Prize just, they're just like 6 years apart from each other, also winning the Nobel.
Yeah. No, that's so great. I mean, so we had said that we would pause right around here to see whether there are any questions from the audience. And I wonder whether, Jamie, you want to come back online. I want to turn this over to you. We can, of course, continue this conversation, but I want to give the audience a chance to weigh in if they would like to.
Yeah, we do actually have about 4 questions right now. So if you want to dive into those.
Do you want to relay them to us?
Absolutely. Okay, our first question is from Lori, and she's wondering, do you include any poetry or anthologies of poetry in your selections?
Great. Absolutely. One of the things I think is so great about thinking about world literature is that poetry is so important in much of the world. And a lot of us, I think, fixate very much on novels. A lot of scholars these days are talking mostly about the novel, which is great. But I was very struck the first time I went to Iran in Shiraz. I host there, took my wife and me to the tomb of Hafez, great poet, classic poet. And his daughter-in-law, who was a doctor, came along, and she started reciting these poems from memory of Hafez. I thought, oh, this is a living tradition right here. How many American doctors will know Shakespeare sonnets, by heart. And so poetry is extremely important. I have a little bit of drama, I have Soyinka, I have short stories, I have epic, but poetry as well as novels. And also, because it's such a way to distill experience, and the poets relate so well to each other. One of my pairings has, Matsuo Basho, a great haiku poet, 17th century, and he has a wonderful poetic travelogue called The Narrow Road to the Deep North, and he goes up and it mixes poems and these visits. So it's a perfect image for like the kind of thing I'm doing. And I pair it with an amazing sequence by James Merrill, Pulitzer Prize-winning American poet, who died maybe 30 years ago. And he goes to Japan and he writes a sequence called A Prose of Departure, which is also a Basho-style travelogue full of references to Basho, and he writes haiku in English. He himself is sick of AIDS, though he doesn't mention this, but he mentions a friend, he displaces it. It's a beautiful travelogue dealing with mortality and dealing with the foreign and dealing with sort of life through poetry. So it's extremely important to recover the importance of poetry in our prosaic world, I think.
I'm so sorry, I was muted. That's awesome. Okay. Well, Mary is wondering, or her question is, I'm hoping we'll fly less and thus emit less CO2 in this climate emergency era. Will your book be a good way to feel we're experiencing the world from home?
Indeed, this my editor had me put in a line, this great thing is you use less carbon footprint if you read this book. So I feel that's true. I don't, Martin, how you're feeling, but I'm thinking maybe I'll travel half as much, a third as much as I was. I mean, I just don't have the same enthusiasm there was a conference in Taiwan that has now just gone virtual, but when it wasn't virtual, I was not going to go 28 hours round trip to go to a conference anymore. It would have to be a very special occasion. I just don't want to do that to the environment or to my body.
I agree. And or travel to San Francisco right now. I'm in Cambridge, you're in Brooklyn. A lot of the listeners are maybe connected, of course, to the wonderful Copperfields bookstore or stores.
The 9 branches.
9 branches, exactly.
You can tour the 9 branches at not too much of a carbon
exactly.
footprint when you're in town.
But no, I completely agree. I completely agree.
And I will say, I mean, I quote, I had a discussion of Saul Bellow, Henderson, the Rain King, and Bellow never went to Africa, but he writes this brilliant novel about it. Voltaire never went to Brazil, writing Candide. At the end of Henderson, the Rain King, Henderson says, well, travel is mental travel. That's what it is. Even if you go in person, it's still mental travel.
That's great. Okay, we have a question from Sheila. She's wondering, are you familiar with the quarterly Stranger's Guide? If so, do you find it valuable?
Martin, do you know that? I do not know it.
Called Stranger's Guide?
Can Sheila explain it?
Yeah,
what it is?
Tell us about it.
Yeah.
Sheila, if you want to just pop in the chat box even what we're missing out on.
We'll come back. Let me say there is a great website called Words Without Borders. I recommend very highly for world literature, just free stuff. And like all the time, they have poetry, short stories. They'll have features on different areas, different authors, different kinds of things. It's such a great way to explore just, nice readable excerpts on the web.
It's a great name too.
It's a wonderful organization. They also have for teachers suggestions. It's a wonderful not-for-profit organization.
And here I might also mention just Archipelago Books, if we're going to plug some different sources. There's so many great books, and it's again kind of nonprofit, Brooklyn-based, good people, and it's a nice image, the archipelago, and all these cool books that you might not hear of. And then they hit it big with the Karl Ove Knausgaard. They publish him in this country, and that's helping a lot of their other books.
And maybe this is just the time to mention that this is a world literature approach to the world, and it's as that only 2% of books published in the United States are in translation, and there's such a premium in this country publishing only English language books, and readers seem to shy away from translation. And I think places like Words Without Borders and your book are just a huge invitation to go beyond our Anglophone bubble, and there's just so much to discover.
Martin, is your speaker right in front of your mouth? It keeps kind of
oh, so sorry.
No,
I'm gonna hold.
Yeah, we want to be able to hear you all the way, so
sorry.
No problem. Okay, Sheila says she just discovered this publication today at an Alta California webinar. And her next comment is, we're not a traditional travel magazine. This is, I guess, what it is. We're not a traditional travel magazine in the sense that it's not about where to stay or what to eat or what to do. There's like a million apps that tell you. This is much more about the place itself.
Interesting. It is interesting that a number of the things I've done for this book have been with travel sites of various sorts. I had a conversation with a guy named Rick Steves. There's a radio syndicated thing on Travels with Rick Steves, and very much about the place. And I think, I still hope that COVID will still allow us to go places, even if we have to be more selective and really choose the times and places and make it really worthwhile. And I'm still not opposed to travel. And there's so many different ways to travel and to learn more about a place, literature certainly being one of the great ways.
And I think that's so true, and that literature can also be a more mindful way of traveling, I think.
Here's a question for both of you. Just curious, do you always read real books, or do you ever prefer digital readers or audiobooks?
Martin, what about you? What's your experience?
I now read a lot books, digital books on I used to read, I suppose, mostly while traveling on a Kindle, but now I've gotten very used to reading on an iPad. And I've done this terrible thing of trying to make the font bigger on physical books, and when they're too small. And so no, I do read. I will say I have really made. I would say I read about half of what I read on an iPad. I have not made the switch to audiobooks. The idea seems completely appealing to me, but I don't commute really. I'm an impatient person. I like to be able to control the speed in which I read. And so I have not, so audiobooks somehow, I'm also not, although I often appear on podcasts, I'm not a big consumer of podcasts, but maybe I should actually just give it a try. How do you do audiobooks, David?
I am just dipping my toes into it. My son is a big audiobook consumer, and I'm right now listening when I exercise half an hour at a time to the Lord of the Rings audiobook. I'm about 15 hours into the 60 hours of the whole thing, and it's actually fantastic because, I mean, as much as I love to read it and teach it from a hard copy text, different things come out. I had never realized, and I've read it 10 times or something, what a pitch perfect ear he has for rural English speech, the way the hobbits speak. And then the differentiation, and it was a really good actor reading it, of the sound of the elves versus the dwarves versus, and different voices within each given species. It's amazing. And because the pace, you're guided by that, you will see things differently, and it makes you focus on things like sound. There's one point in the town of Bree, the gatekeeper says to the hobbits come in, "Well, I can tell by your accent that you're from the Shire." Well, you know that because you hear the accents, and the Shire is like 50 miles away. And this is like really just from the accent, he knows the difference. So yeah, I'm becoming, very positive on audiobooks.
Okay, so we're wrapping down. I think we have one last question, which is kind of perfect here. Genevieve is wondering, what book have you read and studied about time?
Martin, what would be your?
It's a question for you, David.
Well, I would say, I'll give a plug for Proust, Le Cherche du Temps Perdu, In Search of Lost Time. There's no better book, partly because it takes so much time to read it. It will really, I'm a great believer. I have a cousin, Barbara Damrosch, who's very much into this slow food movement, the organic farming and stuff. And I think, slow reading is a great antidote to fast reading. And many of the great books do interesting things playing with time. Proust would be only one of many that are interesting from this point of view. There's a great Turkish novel, The Time Regulation Institute, by Tanpınar, Ahmet Hamid Tanpınar, a great modernist, in which the regulation of time is like a parody of modernization in Turkey, and it's about how it gets used repressively. It's a satirical novel. That's a great novel, also directly about time.
Thanks so much for those suggestions, and thanks so much for being with us tonight. This has been a super compelling and fulfilling hour, and I know where I'm going to start when I need another read. I've also been receiving tons of feedback. People are just loving listening to you both talk. So maybe you'll have to get more into the podcast game, Martin.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And Jamie, thank you.
Yeah. Just a reminder to everyone that yes, this is being recorded. You'll all receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording, a link to the title tonight, discount codes. I'll include some of those websites and also some titles by Martin. So if you did nothing but watch, it's all good. We've got you covered. And Martin and David, thank you. We hope to have you back in person in the near future.
Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thanks so much.
Good night.
Good night.